I'm very transparent about my journey too, that like I am, a lot still a late bloomer when it comes to therapy, like I am still pretty new to it compared to other mental health advocates and people. And in my healing, like I'm not there, totally there yet where I want to be, but it's just about being authentic and transparent. So I think that's what I strive to do with like the podcast, but also like talking about it on social media.
Hey everyone, my name is Hamza Islam, and welcome back to another episode of Oh My Curry Goodness, where I talk to Gen Zers from different fields about their story and how they became the person they are today. One of the things I want to do on each podcast was when I talk to guests, I want to talk to them and talk about the important things and open up in a vulnerable, honest, and authentic way. Because when it comes to inspiring people, we need to see the full picture. And it doesn't just mean all the good things that a person has done. It's also the obstacles they face throughout their journey, all the challenges that they're facing, and whether it be past, present, or future. And so it's really important to know the full story so that there's always that one person that goes, I need to hear this. Because while my journey will be difficult, I know that I'm able to overcome these obstacles because so and so did this, and I know I can do it too. And so I hope you guys continue to check back with this podcast and get to learn more about the interesting stories that people have had or people have that have helped them get to where they are today. Now, my guest this week is Alyx Ang, who is a digital storyteller and mental health advocate. She's a content creator that's focused on life and literature at the intersection of mental health and wellness. She also hosts the podcast A is for Anxious, which is a podcast that tackles the topic of anxiety. And the cool thing about her podcast, and I've been listening to a lot of her episodes lately, is that each episode highlights a new letter of the alphabet that centers around an anxiety that she or her guests have experienced. So it is really cool to be able to connect with a fellow podcaster and also have those authentic, honest, vulnerable conversations that I always like having on this podcast. So Alyx Ang, thank you so much for joining Oh My Great Goodness. I'm really glad to connect with a fellow podcaster.
Yeah, no, I have so much like larger appreciation for podcasters since starting one because it's like not the easiest thing. So thanks for having me.
Of course, I know I feel the same thing. When I first started doing this podcast, I thought it was the easiest thing in the world. But
Hmm.
then boy, did I realize it was difficult. And
Hmm.
obviously we'll talk about growth and like the challenges. But no, it's really I'm glad you said that because sometimes it feels like it's easy because you're just talking and you're having conversations, but it's like especially when it comes to inspiring people and having a relatability aspect, it's like how do you make it so that people feel, I guess, connected or related to the things or just feeling that sense of like I guess a good feeling for lack of a better
Hmm.
phrase.
Hmm.
But
Yeah.
something I really love about your podcast is not just the cool alphabet aspect, but you talk about anxiety and some of the most difficult conversations, whether it be regardless of what a person, either yourself or your guests have talked about. And it's what I find that difficult conversations, while it's such a broad topic, it's one of those conversations that you don't want to have at the present moment, but then in the future, you'll thank yourself for having those because it helped you become a better person. And I know
Hmm.
you're able to give your guests that chance to be able to have those difficult conversations. So I want to ask you, what were some of the difficult conversations? What were some of the most difficult? What were some of the difficult conversations you had growing up that at the time you were like, why are we having this conversation? But now, when as you reflect back, you realize, oh, I'm glad I had these conversations because it has helped me become a better person today.
Yeah, I think the most difficult conversation was actually acknowledging my mental health. I came from a very traditional Asian household, and I think most of my life was spent like suppressing a lot of that, like the acknowledgement that maybe there was something wrong or that I needed to seek help. And so I feel like me as an adult is like the complete opposite of how I was as a kid. Like I went from being a kid and kind of like denying everything to, I mean, being a mental health advocate and talking about it publicly and putting all this content out there, like it sort of like hits me a little bit. Like I'm like, oh wow, younger Alyx like wouldn't have expected this. And I think even with the podcast too, I was a little afraid to take that jump. The podcast is the first public thing where I'm like, I do talk about it on my, Instagram and content creation, but it's subtle. It's kind of meshed in with my content. But the podcast was me like acknowledging this issue and talking about it. And in every episode, even though I'm talking to guests who have experienced anxiety, I still talk about my own experience. So it's 26 episodes for now with guests, but it's also always me sharing something a little bit about myself. So, and when I started it too, I think you'll be interested to know that it was actually going to be a solo podcast. But then I realized that the more I got into advocacy is that there's so many stories I think that need to be told. And I don't know, I feel like I didn't think it was not that I didn't have the expertise to talk about it because I experienced anxiety, but I almost felt like I needed, in order to make it more authentic and true, I needed to have other voices, specifically like Gen Z voices as well. So, yeah, that's kind of what I learned about myself.
For sure. I find that speaking a little bit about the podcast, like I applaud you that you had that idea because I could never do that. Just being able to talk to myself and thinking about what are some things I could talk about so that it connects the audience in any way. But I mean, for me, growing up, and it's interesting you brought up the growing up in an Asian household. So for me, it was never that I suppressed my identity because I'm South Asian, but it was more like I never really understood anything
Mhm.
as in terms of like what does it mean to be someone who is South Asian growing up in the United States? I never thought about that. And so I would say if you were to ask me what is a conversation I didn't like having at the time, but I'm grateful to have now, and it's helped me with this podcast, which is my dad used to say, as you grow older, you're gonna have less and less friends. And the thing is like when you're little, you don't really understand the importance of quality over quantity. You think it's the other way around. So I'm like, no, I want to have all the friends in the world. And as I realized, as I get older, some of the friends that you thought would be really good friends may not be the best friends for you after all.
Mhm.
And so with this podcast, it has really helped me to not only talk with, you know, people that I want to talk to, like yourself, but it's being able to think different, being able to understand that it's okay to be a human being, being able to inspire people. And not everyone will understand the things that we do. And it's up to us as to how to react to those because you can try your best, but sometimes no matter how hard you try, people don't like it. But there are always people that out there that see the work that you do and think that, you know, I don't know if it's okay to not maybe it's okay to not know if you're doing the right thing, but I see what you're doing and I think it's really special. So being able to connect with people and focus on the quality of the people that I meet rather than the quantity is really important. So I know I went on a tangent, but nevertheless, I felt that I'm really happy that I had those conversations because now I always think about who do I want to meet and how will they, excuse me, make me a better person in the future.
Yeah, I agree with that too. I kind of grew up with that as well. You'll have like less friends. And I think when you like being so open about having like a mental illness and having anxiety, that affects your relationships. Like people don't realize it. It affects you internally, yes, 100%, but it also affects how you present yourself to the world. And so I think growing up I had to, yes, look at friendships and relationships in a different way, where most of my relationships and friendships now are people that I've connected with in terms of mental health and in those deep conversations, not people like my childhood friends who, I never shared mental health with, and they don't want to get into that, which is fine. Like I understand that people might not be in the same place as I am, but I'm the type of person who really values that. I need friends who are able to talk about their mental health with each other because I need you to support me, but I want to support you too. So I think growing up I had to realize that.
It's so important to be able to talk to people about mental health. And that's what makes the conversation for lack, I mean, I'm trying to think. I usually say for lack of a better term because at the exact moment I can't think, but
Mhm.
it can be a touchy subject. And
Mhm.
it's important to be able to find those people that are okay talking about it, so then we can think about how to support each other. As far as being a mental health activist or advocate rather, even though they're the same thing, when did you realize that this is something you found interest in? Because I've interacted with a lot of mental health activists, so I'm sure that maybe you can relate to their story a little bit. But it wasn't something like it wasn't something that like you were, I guess, passionate about, but rather there
Mhm.
were a series of events that made you realize, oh, you know what, I think this is for me. So when exactly did you realize, or were there a series of moments where you realized that mental health advocacy is something that you really find interested in and something that you want to continue to do?
Yeah, that's so true. I didn't like, I didn't come out of the womb being like, I want to be a mental health advocate. I really didn't even know what that was. I didn't know, like I said, when I started creating content when I was a lot younger, like at 15, honestly, I was doing book stuff, right? And for a lot of that, I was talking about mental health here and there. I was reading books with like mental health awareness. But my like sequence of events, it was actually, I think I realized that I wanted to be a mental health advocate was when I went to the White House. And I know you're like, whoa, but I really think so like a few years ago when that happened, I had signed up for an opportunity, which at that time was like a storytelling, mental health opportunity. It wasn't like anything like how I imagined it to be. And when I was accepted into that opportunity, I realized that it was mental health advocacy. And I didn't really know that. For me, it's just storytelling. And I'm a storyteller at heart. I'm a writer, I'm a reader, I'm a creator. Like that's what I love. So that was a whirlwind, a sequence of events. I was, pushed into this program where we were creating mental health campaigns. I was with mental health advocates, like 29 other mental health advocates that had already been established in the space, most of them, right? So it's really inspiring to be around that community of these people who are known for being a mental health advocate. And it's almost like you realize that that's a thing. You're like, oh, that's a thing. And talking to all of them, I realized like what they did and how they did it. And I was like, wow, I could do this too. And then going forward, that program led into us, being at the White House and talking about mental health. On the White House stage with the First Lady and like Selena Gomez and the U.S. Surgeon General. And every time I say what's so valuable in mental health advocacy or in advocacy in general with young people is giving them that platform and that stage. And for me, it was the White House, but for many people, it could mean different things. Like, having a stage means giving them a platform, giving them the microphone, giving them the chance to talk in a large meeting full of like, older executives, that kind of stage. So, yeah, that was a very bizarre moment for me because I realized I was like, whoa, like what is this? Suddenly I want to talk about mental health because just talking about my mental health alone with those 29 other advocates, I like felt like I was like healing. So I was like, hey, this is something that I want to do.
I know I'm not a mental health activist or advocate, but what I will say, and this is kind of embarrassing, but the first time I heard about mental health was probably my sophomore year of high school slash junior year of high school. And so
Mhm.
before then, I never really understood what any of these terms meant. Like, what did mental health mean? And sometimes when you grow up in different cultures, mental health is seen as crazy I mean, they're seen as crazy. And so
Mhm.
if you go, oh, I have mental health issues, they go, oh, okay, stay away from this person because they're
Yeah.
crazy. And I also remembered like when people say, oh, I have depression, I used to think, and this is because I never knew it before, I thought depression was, oh, they're in a bad mood. When someone
Mhm.
talked about anxiety, it means they're stressed. But what I failed to understand was that there's a deeper meaning behind these terms. So anxiety is not stress, it's something that is affecting a person's behavior. So as depression, so as mental health in general. And so I don't know if there's someone listening that feels the same way or relates to the same way. I hope that this is what I love about the podcast, which is the relatability aspect. But growing up, I never understood what any of these terms meant. And so that's, I mean, like to say this now is so embarrassing, but It's just because it's never been talked about, it's never been discussed.
Mm.
And when these topics are discussed, it's like it's more of like a short term, like, oh, put the band-aid on, rip it off. And now I look back and I go, oh wow, some of the issues that people are experiencing, it's not like you put on a band and you rip it off. It's no, this takes time and sometimes longer than normal to make sure that they're in a better place than before they got into that.
Yeah, yeah, I think that's 100% true. And I think with anxiety, just like you talked about it, yeah, same here. I thought it was just like, oh, I'm stressed, like, and people do say that. I think a lot when we were a lot younger, it became a part of the younger speak to say like, oh, yeah, like I'm depressed and like very harmful stereotypes of mental health. I won't repeat them for, sake of not triggering people, but I think that's what I want to do with my podcast. Like I have people joining me on the podcast from all different spectrums of anxiety. I have from people who are not diagnosed, who experience anxiety in very situational levels, to people who are diagnosed and medicated on my podcast, including myself. And it's very interesting to have those perspectives, and to bring in people and to really realize that like anxiety looks different for everyone. And anxiety can be like the most sometimes not that scary to the scariest thing. Like I've had panic attacks that felt like I was dying. Like how can something so like small make you feel like you're dying, right? So I think that's what people don't notice about anxiety too, is that like it can be really scary for some people. And then some people experience it differently. It might come like when certain things happen, when they're getting ready to public speak, or very situational. And that's with the podcast as well, is that these small things that seem irrational to some people are some of people's biggest fears.
As a mental health activist, and like I said, I've interviewed many in the past,
Mhm.
and so they've all been able to talk about some of the difficulties they've had being an
Mhm.
activist in this space. So obviously, everyone has their own perspectives, but for you, what are some of the difficult things about being a mental health activist? Like, is there one that really sticks out in your mind?
Yeah, I think being under like the public eye, whether or not like it doesn't matter how big or small you are, if you're an advocate, people are seeing your advocacy and being impacted by it. And so, I'll get comments and people saying, which is great, I love it, but like of being like, oh, thank you for sharing your story, like you've inspired me, like I and same with the podcast too. People have messaged me and they're like, I really love your podcast, it like inspired me to get the help I needed. And that's great. And I'm not saying I don't love that, but it can feel like sometimes, especially with being a mental health advocate and any type of advocate, we're talking climate change, social justice, any of those issues, it feels like you have to, stick to this public view. So for me, when it comes to being a mental health advocate, it feels like I always have to be healing or in good shape in my mental health. And I'm afraid to talk about my bad days. I'm afraid to talk about, my relapses. I'm afraid to show anything other than healing, because then people will think like, oh, she's a mental health advocate and she's even doing bad. You know what I mean? It's a lack of inspiration, I guess you would say, which I feel like I want to give off, the inspiration that you can heal and you can get better. So to go backwards, it almost seems, but again, it's a part of the stigma, right? That, just because you're healing doesn't mean you can't have bad days. So it's something I strike a balance of. It is very difficult though, because I hear this from all my mental health advocate friends too, who are scared to post about their bad days. Um, so yeah, that's a real thing too. And I think there's a huge stigma around that as well.
I mean, it's so weird because people care so much, like especially with mental health, like that. This is what makes mental health advocacy confusing, which
Mm-hmm.
is, and not in like in a bad way, but it's like people expect that you are like the best of the best, or you're like you're totally 100% okay. And I mean, we would love to live in a world where we're all 100% okay, but there's times where we feel anxiety or times where we don't feel 100% right. And so sometimes it's like, but you're a mental health activist, and it's like, and I find that if you're an activist in a field, just being an activist doesn't mean you know everything. It's just that you're really interested in something and you want to learn more about it. And so I think you probably know this better than I do, but I mean, even though you're smart and talented and amazing and everything else, like there's always room to grow. There's always something to learn.
Hmm.
And so you're not done learning. You don't get to a certain point and you go, I'm done. It's you're still going to continue to learn. And so and it's you bring up in everything you say, like about social justice, climate change, just to name a few, right? They don't know everything about the issue, but they're interested in learning more about it. And then
Hmm.
there will be a time where they're able to address these issues and figure out how to overcome them, which kind of leads me to the next thing, because I was talking about how to address these issues and learn about these. I when I first heard about, I mean, this was, I think, maybe the first, I think on your first episode, you talked about how you were diagnosed with general anxiety disorder. And it shocked me because I was like, wow, this person's really good at podcasting. Like, I wish I could be her because I'm nervous half the time. But
Yeah.
and then I saw that you were diagnosed with this, and I thought, wow, so we really are seeing this human moment where she's able to talk about something that I mean, just we didn't know about, especially if you're getting to meet the person for the first time. It's like
Mhm.
she's really good at having conversations, and yet there are things that she's going through. Obviously, I mean, I'm sure that you're still learning more about anxiety and how to address these issues going forward, but there are a lot of people that don't relate to you, and sometimes you meet all kinds of people that will say things that will easily discredit the person you are, or say that what you're saying or what you're doing or what you've experienced is fake or it's not serious.
Yeah.
And I just want to ask, like, what do you wish people knew about anxiety? And it's kind of similar to what we talked about
Yeah.
when I said that, oh, I thought depression was you were in a bad mood, or anxiety you were stressed. I would love to, I mean, now I want to bring that kind of back and go more in depth when it comes to anxiety. Like, what are some things you wish people knew about anxiety that makes it a much more confusing, difficult,
Mhm.
not as straightforward as people make it out to be?
Yeah, it is confusing. There are a ton of anxiety. Anxiety is sort of a feeling that can be like comorbid or like live amongst other like mental health issues like depression and other issues. So it's really hard to like diagnose, like even if you get to the point of diagnosis, but even just realizing yourself, it takes a lot out of people to say they're anxious. It's almost like anxiety is like a bad word. Like we don't want to say anxiety because we think it's weak, when it's really not. It's really powerful, because when you tackle your anxiety head on, you can actually get better at it, and you can learn at how to kind of tackle that anxiety thing. And I think that was a part of why I created the podcast as well, because I do have anxiety, and we talked about this before starting. We were having a little bit of anxiety when joining, but I think every episode that I get on, I become more of a pro, and that's me like being very proactive about talking about my anxiety and healing. But I mean, yeah, I think a lot of people don't realize about anxiety is just how different it looks for people, because I'll still have some people like say like in just like comments or stuff, but some people will be like, oh, that's not like my experience or whatever. But everyone's experiences are different, and I think the number one thing that I talk about in my podcast, and especially in my first episode, is that a lot of things with anxiety can seem irrational. A lot of them, because when you hear that, like, I don't know if you've ever talked to like a teacher or a family member and you're like, I'm anxious about this. And it's just like, oh, you're being irrational. Like, oh, like, stop. Yeah, right. Like, that's not good to hear. But sometimes it can feel like that, like how some anxieties are irrational. And that's why I think I used this idea of this alphabet. When I was a lot younger, I would write everything that I was anxious about. And how I qualified that was like my heart used to race, right? So much that I would faint. Like I would pass out. Um, and how I would do that is I would write in a little notebook all the things that would make me anxious. And I think looking back at that as an adult, I was like, wow, I was anxious about a lot of things, And I'm like, how many other people have these anxieties of just these random things? Like I'll see a bug and it'll make me anxious, and I'll write that down. So I think using that using something as common and as, approachable as the alphabet to talk about anxiety it sort of brings this like childish factor, this very like, inner child. And that's kind of what I wanted to do with the podcast. I wanted people to be able to relate, yes, but also feel like it's not that serious if they're listening to like a podcast of someone talking about their deep, anxiety and dread over like for my recent episode was quite a controversial one, even for me. And I think this is going into like, what are some conversations that you're scared of having? And I think for me, I am not afraid of talking about my anxiety because I know what I'm feeling. I don't need anyone to validate that, and I'll talk about it. But when it comes to other people, I'm almost scared to engage in a conversation with them just because I have not experienced it. So it's an unknown to me, right? And so for my recent episode for the letter K, I brought someone on to talk about their anxiety of kids. And I think it's a very, very deep episode. There's a lot we talk about that, but it might be upsetting to some people who don't have an anxiety of kids, who are mothers, who are caretakers. You know what I mean? So it's having those difficult conversations and realizing that episode gave me so much anxiety. We were filming and I'm like, this might upset some people, but yeah.
Oh my gosh. I was smiling this whole time because I realized like there were so many things you said that I feel related to. Apart from the podcast, like I always try to make sure that they're comfortable with the topics because there's nothing worse than them going on the podcast, I don't want to talk about this, or
Mm-hmm.
even worse, they leave the meeting and it's like, oh
Oh.
no. But it's so funny because I freak out about everything. And so it may have been because of movies, because I remember there was a movie, I think it was called it was Planet of the Apes, probably the most recent one, where like blood dropped on the ground or on the floor, and in the next movie everyone turned into an ape. And so it's like the smallest of things made the biggest of differences. And so
Mm-hmm.
maybe it could also be because of the memes that I saw. So as someone who's South Asian, and probably you can relate to this in a bit,
Yeah.
where they go like, you need 100%, you need an A plus on this particular paper test, and if you ever saw like 99%, then it's an F. And I remember seeing these
Oh
memes
yeah.
and I would laugh, but at the same time, now that I look back, I go, this is so me, right? Like I'm the type of person that if I see his hand sanitizer that says kills 99.99% of germs, I go, well, what about the 0.01%? It doesn't
Yeah.
kill that. And it's having like freaking out over things. It's so difficult because you when it's like it feels like you're the only one feeling a certain way. And so
Mm-hmm.
just another example today, my the garage door was open and I told my little brother I'm gonna close it, and he's like, no, I'm gonna go outside in a few minutes. And I go, but what if someone comes in and robs us?
Yes.
And my
Mm-hmm.
brother's like, that's never happened. Why would you think that? And I go, because you never know. And so I don't have like I've never been diagnosed with anything or with any anxiety, but I always feel like I'm just quote unquote weird because I'm like I have to. Or just another example, I know I'm bouncing off, but it's like there's so many things that you said, I'm just like I want to have a whole discussion. But
Yeah.
sometimes when I close my door on my car, I would check every door once, and then I would check to make sure. I would check again because sometimes like you double check your work, and
Oh
then
yeah.
so I'll be like, okay, double check, got it, and then I would triple check. So I guess it's like to check to make sure that I did it. And the reason why was because there was one time where I accidentally left the door open and nothing was ever stolen, but it's like you never know, like some
Mm-hmm.
valuable, like your car registration or something that you thought was really valuable to you just goes like just is gone. So
Yeah.
I'm always like, as like it's not. I mean, I know the term is obsessive compulsive disorder. I've not been diagnosed with that, but it's like sometimes I feel like I do have it because I'm constantly checking to make sure that everything is good because I'm worried about the worst possible scenario. So
Yeah.
it's it's like I know people say like don't worry about it, you're overthinking too much, but it's like you think I'm overthinking, but have you been thinking enough? So
I love that. No, I need to say that. I need to say it. Next time someone comes at me with that, I'm gonna be like, really? Because have you been thinking? I mean, yeah, it sounds like you need to be on my podcast, but But yeah, I agree with that too. I have this similar things. And for me, what the scariest thing is when I think those things, I can't just shut them out. So like, if I the same thing, let's take your garage door example. If something like that happens, I won't be able to sleep or eat until that thing is closed. And people might think that's, oh, like, what are you doing? Why aren't you sleeping? Like, are you kidding me? But it's really, it takes over. And that's the thing I think also to the question you asked before of what people don't know about anxiety and some other mental health issues is it's out of our control, bro. Like if I had control, you would have best bet I would have gotten this already. But it is a lot of mental health issues are some are even like hereditary or like can be passed down and also out of your control. Like your brain chemistry is just different from other people. So I think that's like I don't choose to be like wake up every morning and like be anxious every day. So yeah, I think that's something that you brought up too is like even not being diagnosed, like you can acknowledge you have anxiety because it helps. It really doesn't help when people are like, oh, you're crazy, or just stop thinking too much, because then yeah, it makes me want to get defensive. I'm like, no, you should think more.
I so while you were saying this, there's an embarrassing story. It's funny looking back, but at the same
Mhm.
time, it was scary at the moment. So
Mhm.
I'm Muslim, and so we celebrate Eid al-Fitr and then Eid al-Adha. And so Eid al-Adha is and this on this occasion we donate meat. So one third goes to family, one third goes to friends, one third goes to the needy. And so there was one time where all the meat came in, and we were thinking about okay, who do we give it to? What portion? Like what 33% or what
Mhm.
one third goes to us? What one third goes to this group? One third goes to this group. And so we were trying to like clean everything up. And I don't know, there was a part of me that was wondering like if I accidentally put a bone in like the trash can. And so what we were trying to do is make sure that we got everything, and then like because like some of the meat was still bloody and gross, like we had to clean that up. So I remember I had all the trash bags and then all the plastic bags, and I was like, okay, I'm gonna throw all this away. But then there was a part of me that thought, what if there was a bone in the bag? And the reason
Mhm.
why I thought that was because come trash day, if they see a bone, they're going to be like, what is this? They're going to come investigate. And so I remember it was a day before trash day, and I was looking at this trash can, and my mom was like, what are you doing? And I go, Mom, I saw a Jeffrey Dahmer documentary where he used to like literally have bones of human beings. And so I'm
Mhm.
thinking to myself, because I saw that, what if they think this? And like, what if someone thinks about this and they go, they're never gonna think that.
Yeah.
But I go, but you never know. And so
Yeah.
I know
Mhm.
it's something that I just was said 5,000 times probably, but like that feeling, it just doesn't go away. And sometimes what I try to do is like I try to like pretend that I'm slamming the door on someone. So it's like I don't need this in my life. But then sometimes I'm
Mm.
like, maybe I need to check it. And so
Mhm.
like sometimes repeating things 2 or 3 times is what I need just to make sure that the worst possible scenario really,
Mhm.
really doesn't happen.
Yeah, I think that too, and I think I realized that early on. Early on, I'm like, okay, there is something about me that is really hindering like my experience in life. Like man, I'm like getting the worst cards. But I think that's how I have healed. Taking agency of that anxiety, saying it so many times that it becomes like background noise. With this podcast too, you know I don't want to see it as a weakness. I want to see it as something really powerful. So by talking about it and by turning my, in my opinion, worst asset into something that could potentially be successful and help a lot of people, for me is so powerful and has just helped me so much. And I'm very transparent about my journey too, that like I am, a lot still a late bloomer when it comes to therapy, like I am still pretty new to it compared to other mental health advocates and people. And in my healing, like I'm not there totally there yet where I want to be, but it's just about being authentic and transparent. So I think that's what I strive to do with like the podcast, but also like talking about it on social media. So,
I also want to add, because we both have podcasts, one of
hmm.
the interesting things about me is that I love talking to people. I like to think of myself as someone who's outgoing, but I also have social anxiety, and that part
Same.
scares
Yeah.
me. It's so weird because when it comes to podcasts, and it's weird. Like if you don't know who I am, like for those who don't know who I am, it looks as though I'm having that like just genuine conversations. If I have to do a speech in front of someone, I'll be perfectly fine. I mean, obviously, my concern will then be like, is the content I'm saying going to benefit someone? But I'm still just give me something, give me a topic. I'll be happy to speak.
Mm-hmm.
But that's because you know what to say on the podcast or on a
Yeah.
speech or whatever. But the moment I meet someone just informally, I'm treating it as like a go big, go home, or for sports fans, it's like a game seven. Like you cannot mess this up. And so growing up, I don't know if this is something you relate to, but only because
Mm-hmm.
we're talking about anxiety. So I feel like I send more text messages to people than people send me text messages. So if I ask someone, hey, do you want to hang out? And they'll say, sure, we'll hang out, whatever. If someone asks me to hang out, I don't know how to react to that because there's a part of me that's like, oh, wow, someone really thought about me. But then I'm like, I got to make sure this is the best experience for them possible.
Oh my
Because now
God,
I feel
yeah.
like it's like a business thing where
Yeah.
it's like it's not just you want to make sure they come back because if you have a business you want to make sure customers come back and support your business. So for me it's the same thing where if a friend reaches out to me, I'm thinking about 8,000 things at once where I'm like, okay, what do I do, what do I say, how do
Mm-hmm.
I treat myself, how do I try to be the best version of myself? Like I know that technically those are the two questions, but like then again there's 8,000 things thinking of. But I'm constantly thinking about things because I'm like, well, what I want to build that friendship, but I don't know what the right or wrong answer is. And then
Mm-hmm.
sometimes like I used to have this thing, I still do at Ohio State, where some of my close friends, I'll say, sometimes I treat friends or quote unquote friends like those like Genie and Aladdin. I don't know if you've seen Aladdin, but sometimes after 3 or 4 times, a person doesn't want to talk to me. And I'm like, why? I just needed help because I'm confused about a specific situation. I was
Mm-hmm.
never trying to be like creepy or uncomfortable. It's just I needed help. I thought you'd be the right person, but clearly you think I'm a pest or a burden. So, yeah, I mean, I say that because like it's just such a weird feeling to have, and I know this was something that you talked about in your podcast, so I know when I said it, you were like excited as well to talk about it. But yeah, it's just weird because like I love talking to people, but at the same time, I'm frightened. And when presented the opportunity to have like a genuine conversation that's not podcast related or not giving up speech related, I'm really thinking of like, what do I have to do to make this person want to hang out with me in the future? I don't know if
Yeah.
that's something you relate to, but I just really
That's
wanted to say that.
No, thank you so much for, and I think you perfectly describe. Obviously, everyone's experience are different, but I am diagnosed with social anxiety as well. So I have the same exact experiences, although for me, I cancel plans because I don't even want to go there. I don't when I do agree to do something, yes, I make that point like it has to be the best experience or they're never going to text me, invite me. But sometimes when people invite me, I reject every like they'll do it over and over again and I'm always testing them. I'm like, how many rejections can I give them before they like finally stop? I try to like make a balance, but yeah, for and I think that's the thing with anxiety too that people don't know. Like some of the most successful people that we know of personally or publicly, celebrities deal with anxiety, deal with depression, deal with all of these mental health issues that we villainize. And it's so amazing to like think of that because I would call myself a high functioning anxious person. Like I'm yes, I'm anxious and I, have this disorder, like I take medication, but I can accomplish some of the like most amazing things. Sometimes for me, I'm like, what? This is dissonance. Like I don't really understand this. It doesn't really make sense to me, but I feel like I'm very ambitious, can get stuff done very fast, and yet I have this thing that stops me from doing a lot of things. So I think that's what people don't realize about anxiety too. Like it's an invisible like illness, you can't see it and you can't that's why you can't judge people and that's why you have to be very understanding of it is because some of like my closest friends have anxiety too and it can be hard when you have like all these relationships, right? You have anxious person interacting with an anxious person, but then you have anxious person interacting maybe someone who doesn't have anxiety, who doesn't understand that experience. So I think it's all about being open to other people's experiences. Like just as you were talking about your experience with social anxiety, it's not the same as mine, but it's very familiar, you know? So yeah, thanks for sharing that as well. I know I really would love for you to come on an episode of my podcast. And I know it's very hard to kind of open up, but once you start doing it, you're like, wow, I just keep word vomiting. Like I just need to share. Like this is what it feels like. And it sounds so like weird to talk about it that way. When I explain my anxiety to like my therapist, I'm like, no, you're gonna think I'm like so like bonkers, but I'm about to tell you something that's and she's like, no, that's normal. I'm like, okay, cool.
Before we
Hmm.
transition, excuse me, into the podcast, there's one thing I wanted to add because you said that sometimes you cancel plans.
Hmm.
What I would do, and this is more like something needs to happen in order to
Hmm.
make this happen. Sometimes I would avoid a person, but that's more because if I like what I in the community that I grew up in, my parents were never like this, so thank God. But sometimes
Hmm.
in with my parents' friends, they love comparing their kids to other kids. And
Hmm.
so, for example, let's say you were South Asian and someone said, "Oh, Alex is going to Harvard. You know, why can't you be like her? Why can't you? She's so smart. She's doing all these extracurricular activities." And I would be like, if let's say you and I were like genuine friends, I'd be like, I don't want to talk to her. And then when someone says why, like, or if you ever say like, hey, what happened? Then I would come up with the cringiest line like, it's not you, it's me. But
Yeah.
that's because sometimes people like now you become jealous and envious. And so when people do want to reach out, sometimes I just avoid them. And that I mean, I don't know if that's technically social anxiety, but sometimes it's like you know who they are as a person, but then other people paint a picture that you can't
Hmm.
paint. And so now because of the fact that you guys are in different status, it's like maybe I don't want to connect with this person because I feel like if I do, I feel like I won't be good enough. And so there will be times where someone like growing up, like I would be compared to so and so, and then I'll just avoid them. Even if they wanted to talk to me, I'm just more like, yeah, the weather's nice. And then just
Yeah.
move as far away as possible. But it's not because of them, it's because of
Yeah.
me. And I know it sounds like a bad thing, but it's it's like you get what I mean. It's complicated, but it's like
Oh yeah.
it's just because of some circumstance that you and I cannot control. And I wish I could be like you, but I don't know. It's like yeah,
Yeah.
and that's what makes social anxiety or anxiety confusing to people. It's just that sometimes you just don't know. It's just once it's there, it's there. You have no control over it, like you
Yeah.
said.
Yeah, I'll add something. I had that 10 times worse. I had a twin sister, identical twin sister. So I was not just compared with the kid next door, the other Asian kid, my cousins, my whatever. I was compared with my sister, and it was the most convenient comparison for my parents, to pit me against my sister who does not is not diagnosed or doesn't really experience it the same way I do or less intensely. So growing up and experiencing that's traumatizing. Like even to talk about now, moving away from like my family and my sister, being my own person is only when I was able to start healing, like away from my family, because without that I would be compared and sort of like pitted against my other siblings. So yeah.
Well, I'm glad we can relate to that in some sense. And I
Mhm.
know I feel like we spent like 30 minutes on this discussion, but
No, it's
nevertheless, I was like, this is when I first heard about this podcast or your podcast, which I want to talk about now. I was just thinking to myself, I got to have these conversations because there's a part of me, and over time, because people, when I first started, people didn't know who I was. I just said I was a student at Ohio State, but I told them that as I continued doing podcasting,
mm,
people would know more about me. So I feel like this is the most vulnerable and honest and authentic I've been on this podcast. So I'm glad
good for
that
you. Yeah.
I'm glad you I'm glad you're the type of person that centers on these conversations. But I want to talk about your podcast. A is for anxious. And obviously we spent a while talking about our anxiety. Do you find that your podcast has helped you personally, whether that's making your anxiety issue less worse or less painful? Like maybe you're feeling 1% better Now
Hmm.
that you had those discussions, tell me a bit about how the podcast has helped you personally, not just like
Hmm.
the conversation wise, but more as Alex Ang as a human being.
Yeah, well, the podcast has made me realize that I don't live in a bubble. First of all, like anxiety looks different for other people. Some of my guests experience it worse than I do. And for that, it's obviously like, no, we're not celebrating like someone, going through worse than you, but it's just so honest and authentic to hear that like you're not the only one, you're not alone. Essentially, that's like the whole thing with the podcast is you're not alone. I say in my intro like tackling this taboo topic of anxiety because people think anxiety is one thing when it's can be 26 things of the alphabet and even more if anything. So like I think that's one thing that I wanted to do. I definitely think I have healed. I say now that like with all my creative endeavors, I'm someone who like just has so many ideas. So I start so many things. I had a blog, I had, whatever, I have a YouTube channel, and I do all these things. But I feel like the podcast is like what I was like put on this earth to do. Like when I started that, and that idea too literally came out of like I wanted to talk about my anxiety and I needed some way to package it. And that's the way I wanted to do the podcast. I had so many other ideas for that, but yeah, every time I go to it's a lot of work, yes. Like I, have a full-time job and it's really hard to keep up with that podcast. If it were up to me, I would love that to be my full-time job. But it's really hard to keep up with it. But every time I have a conversation with someone, I always enjoy it. I'm always so nervous in the beginning. I think about canceling. Sometimes when I do my episodes and schedule them, because I schedule the episodes with my guests, I want to cancel. I want to message them and be like, oh no, sorry, I can't actually do it today, can we do it like next week, just to put off the feeling of like speaking to them. But every time I'm done with that episode, I feel like I could like sleep for days. Like my mind is clear and all of that. So 100% it's worth it. I feel like I've healed. I don't know. I feel like I haven't healed 100%, but I would say like 30%. It is, working with medication and therapy. It's part of my like healing process over these coming days. So, yeah.
For sure. And to add on, I don't expect your healing journey to be perfect by a
Hmm.
certain point. It's a continuous thing.
Yeah.
But I would say the same thing. I relate to you in when it came to how my podcast started because I was always curious about learning about what it is like to what it's like to be a person. And so
Hmm.
I remembered when sophomore year started, and that was my first year on campus because my freshman year was interrupted by the pandemic. And
Hmm.
so meeting people that I wanted to hang out with in high school and then telling me, because I used to have, I mean, for lack of a better, let's just say in high school, we used to say like, who's the most popular kid in school and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And so I remember
Mhm.
like meeting some of the people who I thought was like popular, respected. And then they would say, oh, I went to therapy. And I go, you? Like, what are you talking about? And so
Yeah.
and it's funny because I brought this up with athletes. So I love watching sports, big soccer fan, and so one of the questions I was thought of myself thought to or one of the questions I would ask myself when I was little is, can an athlete go to a grocery store? And essentially that question meant like, can they be a normal human being, or the moment do
Mm.
they go into the store, they're surrounded? And so for me, like when I started this podcast, it was just to learn about um, what it's like to be what it's like to be a particular person. So I say that because you talked about like the pod, like you feel like you were brought on this earth to do podcasting and to be able to share your experiences.
Yeah.
So that's what I found, I guess, somewhat relatable to. And like I said, I'm not a mental health activist, but I can definitely
Yeah, no.
relate to the like I guess the background behind why you did a podcast.
Yeah, I also go ahead.
Oh no, go ahead, go ahead.
I also like the people that come on my podcast are normal people. Like I don't think people realize that I didn't like come up with a list of people. When I started the podcast, it was literally okay, I literally launched the first episode, right? Had no idea what I was going to do for the other episodes, had nothing planned. And then people started reaching out to me like just normal people, my followers, some of them, right? Or someone who had heard of it. And then I started feeling it. And now I have every episode until for season one booked out for until the end of it. Right. And like these, I didn't approach anyone for this. I didn't know how it was going to be. I just like put out the first episode and I was like, oh, okay, I'll have to come up with the entire alphabet on my own. And then it was really these like people really inspired me, just like asking if they can like go on and talk about it. I swear it's really cool to look at like my little spreadsheet with all the coming alphabets, because it's like some of these things like I would have never thought of, because when you think of the alphabet in like my podcasts, I always ask my guests to guess what the next episode is going to be. So it's like they're doing word association. Like if I tell you to like come up with the letter S, right? Like you have to really think about like what's the first word that comes to your mind, like social anxiety or whatever. But these are people who are intentionally coming to me and being like, hey, I have something for the letter X or the letter, whatever. And that's how I filled out the podcast. So is that was really just the most like inspiring moment for me to realize that like people are actually interested, and not just any people. Like these are just normal people. Like I didn't care how many followers you had. Like I want you on my podcast if you're willing to talk about it.
For sure, I would love to be on your podcast.
Yeah.
And obviously now then my nerves and anxiety would kick in. But I there were so many things that you talked about. Well, I know I just said that, but then again, I mean, this was such an amazing conversation. But there I, when I first started this podcast, I didn't know if my idea made sense. But then kind of how you said that season one is booked out. Like for me, I had about 60 to 70 people by the end. So I launched in January 2023, but I started this
Oh,
process in April
oh
of
wow.
2022. So between April of 2022 and December, I had about 70, maybe even 80 people interested in the podcast. And so
Wow,
I was
yeah.
like, well, I'm good for 2 seasons technically,
Yeah.
but I'm just like, wow, there's so many people. And you brought up the sometimes like you want to cancel meetings, and that is me because mostly
Oh
because
yeah.
yes, well, not yours, not yours, not yours. um, but sometimes I would cancel because I'm worried about what's the worst thing that could happen, and
Mm.
secondly, are they a human being? And like I would say, like sometimes I would be in the Zoom call and then I would just hope that they wouldn't make it because I'm worried about what could happen. Maybe they might think they're better than me because I'm literally a nobody and then they're a somebody. And so sometimes I'm just thinking like, what's a good excuse?
Oh
Hey,
yeah.
sorry to cancel. My dog ate my laptop, I think, and I
Yeah.
just can't. I don't have a dog, but like sometimes, like I'll maybe think of an excuse if needed, or just expect them to cancel. But once I have those conversations, I
Mm.
literally feel so much better knowing that
Right.
they are a human being. They are not. They have feelings, and it's weird because like I'm a computer science major, so sometimes it's like,
Oh
oh,
wow.
do you guys talk to robots? And it's like no, but sometimes you do meet people that talk like a robot. Like they don't express
Mm.
themselves authentically and vulnerably, or authentically and in a vulnerable way. And so, yeah, the before, like I guess, like the pregame can definitely be nervous, but then I guess during the game and then post game, and I don't know, you don't have to talk about the numbers and your analytics, but like after each conversation, I don't ever think about that because I know, oh, I know someone's gonna listen to this episode and they're gonna be like, I needed to hear that. And so
Mm-hmm.
yeah, like after every conversation, yes, there are things you can definitely improve on, but in general, every episode that I've had so far, and I'm sure in the future, I mean, I felt so much better. So
Yeah.
it's yeah, it's weird that we have these feelings, but and sometimes like sometimes I'll go into a conversation or I'll go like I'll end a conversation feeling really good, and then the very next episode or the next recording I'll go, I'm not, maybe I should cancel, not realizing that maybe something good will happen just like this episode. So
Mm-hmm.
it's it's a weird emotion to have, but yeah, like I'm trying to constantly figure out how to not be nervous. Not necessarily how to be excited,
Mm.
how to not be nervous before every episode. So yeah, it's like wow, it just opens up so many things, but I mean I'm constantly just trying to work on the not being nervous part because
Mm-hmm.
when you are interviewing people you might be nervous, but they're going to be even more nervous. And if you're nervous, you're not helping them. So
See, that's why I love having a podcast about anxiety because I am totally, I go into literally every recording sweating and I'm literally like, hey, I'm sorry, I'm kind of anxious right now. And it's acceptable because they know they're going to be talking about their anxiety. So, me as a host, I just have to focus on listening to them. And that's the thing, too. It can be kind of a nerve. I think it is. It brings me a little bit of comfort to know that my guests might be a little more anxious to talk because they're the ones doing the talking. I'm guiding conversation and bouncing off of their ideas, but for the most part, for the episodes, the ones that I haven't done alone, they've been less anxiety inducing because I know I'm going to be in a conversation with other people who are being as vulnerable, if not more than me. So yeah, it's this kind of balance too. But I totally understand that, and I'm glad we're able to open up because I don't hear that a lot with podcasters. I have a lot of podcaster friends that don't talk about like anxiety, and I'm like, is this just a me? Is this a me thing?
for sure, there's like
Mhm.
it's so I'm like I said, I'm a big soccer fan, and so one of my favorite teams is Liverpool Football Club, and
Mhm.
they compete in England, and their motto is "You'll never walk alone." And so I just thought like maybe it's a soccer thing, but nevertheless, I mean, whenever you take a journey, it feels like you're alone, but there's always
Yeah.
people that you can work with or that you can band together to take that or to go on that journey. Um, I do want to talk about a couple of topics.
Mhm.
I noticed I
Yeah.
said topics, not questions, but topics before I let you go. Um, so for my podcast, one of the things that this podcast, one of the things I've really had to understand is that sometimes you need to change things to make the podcast experience better, not just for yourself, for your guests, but well, yeah, not just for yourself, for your guests, but also especially your listeners. And well, actually, let me put it that way: not just for your listeners, not just for your guests, but for you. That's what I meant. And I've had to make some changes. And one of the things that sometimes we don't like change because it makes us feel like we're stupid,
Mhm.
but there's always and like I hate, there's a sentence I hate when it comes to podcasts or creating something, which is I should have done this, right?
Oh yeah.
There are moments where you're like, I did it a certain way. Maybe I didn't like it. Maybe someone didn't like it and they told me to do it this way. Or sometimes I would watch my favorite podcasters do a certain way and I go, I should have done it this way.
Yeah.
And now that I've incorporated it into my podcast, I feel better. Of course, there's still things that I need to work on and learn from, and I know that's going to come. But at this moment in time, looking back, there's so many I should have done this, I should have done this moments, and as much as I hate that I say it, I'm glad that I said it because it's about growth. And so I want to ask you, I know you've done many episodes, but only you know your podcast better than anyone else. So what have been examples of those of what have been examples of times where you said, I should have done this? You get what I mean?
Yeah. Uh, that's a really hard question. I think with everything, I always want kind of like the best, best quality, best kind of listening experience. And I think for me, I'm a very methodical person though. I think that's what anxiety has taught me. I kind of have to like preemptively think about everything. So before I even launched the podcast, I had like literally everything. I hired a designer to work with me on this concept of designing something because I had a very specific vision. I was like, use fridge magnets. I was like, we need to create I had a very specific idea and I'm very specific. So like with anyone who works with me, they know that I have a very specific vision. And that might not be the best when you're working with like a designer or someone third party because they like to be creative, but then you're like, no, stick to this. Um, but yeah, I think I definitely don't have as many should haves. Just because I spent so much time planning it and, thinking about all this. I mean, in retrospect, obviously, I would have loved to have the budget to like fly guests out so you can talk to them in person. Those big budget, yeah, those big budget podcasts that we see on YouTube and whatever. They're able to fly their guests out, have, the great equipment that's not the Yeti USB snow but I think that and I think that's why for me, the highlight of my podcast is not the design, it's not the concept, it's not the amazing video quality, no, the quality. I also get my partner to custom make music for that. So it's not even the music too. It's the conversations. Like, I hope if you're coming here, you're ready to sit down. And you know what? You might be uncomfortable. I've had some people, some friends, and even some family members who've listened to it, been like, okay, like I'm a little uncomfortable, so I had to like pause your podcast and I'll come back to it later. I actually, honestly, what I wanted to have done is make it even more uncomfortable. I think in the beginning episodes, I was still figuring out my style, as all podcasters kind of do if we're like doing it ourselves. So in retrospect, I would have loved to go even deeper with my guests. I think for the first few episodes, they're a lot different than the ones I'm having now. The ones I'm having now are super deep. I feel like I just like let go of all the rules and I'm like, yeah, we're going to talk about whatever. But in the first few episodes, I think I was really, hyper fixated on what I was saying instead of just saying what came to mind. So yeah, thinking about what I should have done is just I should have definitely been consistent with my episodes, but definitely not try to like censor anything that was coming to mind, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I totally understand what you're saying, and it's funny when you were talking about those in-person big budget.
Yeah.
While you were saying that, I just remember like sometimes my friends would say, "Hey, you know what you should do? You should fly out your guests and then have
Like,
curry," because the podcast is called "Oh My
oh
Curry Goodness."
yeah.
And I'm like, "Do you know how much money it costs to bring these people? Like, do you think I have the budget for that?" But nevertheless, I would love to do that. And if we do have in-person guests, I would 100% love to have you as an in-person guest eating curry, and hopefully you don't go to the hospital because sometimes curry can get
Mine
people
has to
sick.
be no, sorry, mine has to be mild or at least not spicy.
I'll keep that in mind. But no, for sure, like those are definitely like, and it's difficult, but things take time. And
Yeah.
one more question I have about your podcast before I take it straight out of left field, because I just thought about this because I saw that you were a
Whoa.
big into books and literature and art. What do you feel like is the biggest challenge? Obviously, when this episode comes out, you're gonna still have a couple of episodes released, but what do you feel like is the thing you're working on the most when it comes to your podcast? Because, like I said, you're constantly learning, you're constantly trying to figure out how to be better. What are some things you're working on? And maybe you talked about it a little bit, which is like trying to
Yeah.
get them to be more uncomfortable, or maybe I'm
Yeah.
putting words in your mouth, but like, what are some of the things you're thinking of where you're going, I want to do this in future episodes because I think it will make the experience more unique?
Ooh, I don't think it's related to experience. It's actually a question that you like sent me beforehand, but I am so anxious about season two. Like everyone keeps asking me. I know I really hit it out of the guys. I know I hit it out of the park with this idea, okay, for season one, but I have no freaking clue what's coming next. And I think that's it's definitely something that I think about way more than I actually thought. I did for me. I didn't even think about season one, season two. That just came out of because you have to do that on like Spotify or whatever platform you do. I honestly just planned on releasing 26 episodes and then disappearing into the void. Like it was sort of a thing that I wanted to complete and then leave it up for existence, right? But now you actually wouldn't be surprised because you asked me the same thing too. Is that the number one question that I get for my podcast is what happens when you finish the alphabet? And I don't know why that's been causing me so much anxiety, but it is this idea of us as creators and, makers is chasing the next big thing, thinking that I'm falling into a little bit of we're thinking that I have to make the second season, even better. Like honestly, I don't think a good idea is a better idea than what I have for season one is going to come out of this brain. I just don't. I really and like I don't see anything wrong with for season two going through the alphabet again, getting more people, but there's this pressure I feel like to make it even better than season one. So that's kind of something that I know like everyone's been asking me to. So yeah, it's a very interesting thing when I think about like how I can be better, like what I would do differently. And I don't know, was that the answer you were expecting for that?
Yeah, and don't worry about answering it in the way that
No,
you
you're
would
good.
think. It's because it's such a difficult answer, and I'm gonna, if you were to ask, and I'll answer this too,
Mhm.
maybe you can relate to this, which is I don't want to play my podcast safe. And what I mean by that, and you talked a bit about uncomfortness, there is a level to which you don't want to, a level that you don't want to reach, or a specific point you don't want to reach because you don't, like I said, want the guest to leave. But and I'm not trying to mock any podcaster. I promise if there's a podcaster listening to this and going, is this person mocking me? I promise I'm not.
Yeah.
But it's like, I love asking different questions and I love having a conversation. And there's nothing like, sometimes I'll receive emails or text messages from guests and saying, when do you want to schedule an interview? And I go, it's not an interview, it's a conversation.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
don't, and the reason why is I feel like an interview is safe. So it's like question, answer, move on to the next question. And that's what I did when I first started this podcast, where I was like,
Oh, okay.
question one, okay, that's the question one. What's your thought? What are your thoughts on this question? Okay, I don't really care what this person said. Question two, answer. And it's like,
Yeah.
there are things that you said that people may have said that maybe you need to go even more in depth, right? So my fear is, when you have conversations, they last longer. And sometimes people will say, like, sometimes people will make fun of, well, I know for South Asians, like, sometimes people will say, when you have a conversation with a South Asian person or with a person of South Asian descent, it's a really, really long conversation. So if you feel like you
Mm.
talked for like 5 minutes, you've actually talked for an hour. That's technically true. But nevertheless, like, for me, I love having conversations and being authentic and being off script, which can be scary because, like, there's nothing worse than not knowing what to say. But then again,
Yeah.
it's about those human moments, because being off script is a human moment. And so I want to constantly work on, and that's why and I said this before, or may have said this before we started recording, which is, I like to overthink and think about,
Yeah.
how can I make a conversation authentic and not, and just have like those, like, get the best out of the person. Because even if you do as much research on a person as possible, if you just stick to question and answer, you're not really connecting with the guest.
Hmm.
And that's one of the things that my little brother, who would sometimes watch this podcast, and sometimes I would do, like, I would watch the episode to edit, then watch the episode as a subscriber or as a listener, and then watch it again. I know I'm technically messing up my statistics, but I would watch it again to think about, how can I make the next conversation possible?
Yeah, I love that.
Because it's just like, I don't want it to be safe. I don't want to be like, let's take the easy route. I'd rather take it to this route. But sometimes, like, again, that fear we talked about, like excuses, like, are they a human being? And we know they are, but do we know they are? So that's kind of
Hmm.
like what I was thinking. And I know I explained a lot. It may have sounded confusing, but I just want to have those conversations where it's it's authentic, and it's not just a question and answer. It's just that it's like a question, and then you give your answer, and then see if we can build on top of each other. And the moment we stop, then we focus on the next question, because I think
Yeah.
that's how
Hmm.
you get the best version of a person. It may be a longer conversation, but it's like, it's a useful conversation. So
Yeah,
that's what I was thinking.
yeah. No, I completely agree. And also, like, I don't do the podcast for anyone but me. Like, I don't, I actually don't look at the numbers very often. In the initial stage, obviously, yes, because like it's the launch, it's exciting, whatever. I barely look at it now. I like I post my stuff, do whatever, do like Instagram, whatever, and I hear most feedback through like Instagram because it's very interactive there. But I don't really focus on the numbers because the podcast, at the end of the day, it's for me. And I bet you do this podcast also for you too, because it's just so like it's interesting. This podcast is really interesting to like dig into the brains of like, other, Gen Zers, and, talking to them again. Like, yeah, it's like answering this question that it's your internal curiosity. Like, are you really human? Because like many people don't really have the same curiosities as us. Like for me with my podcast, people probably don't care about this other person's anxiety, but I care. Other people who experience anxiety care. So, yeah, I think at the end of the day, too, especially when creating this podcast, you really have to understand who you're creating it for. Are you creating for other people? It's fine if you are, like, no shame to that, but know who your audience is, know how you're going to build that out. But if you're doing it for yourself, it's a completely different route. You don't really take the same route. So, yeah, it's a very, very interesting conversation.
For sure. And I also want to add, like, sometimes, like I said, I will watch my episodes more than once. And it's mostly because to think about, how can I be better? but then
Yeah.
there's a part of me that gets anxious as to whether the episodes are still there, because when you're editing, and I'm sure you know this as well, like when you're editing, sometimes it takes a lot of storage in your computer. So I'm
Oh,
just like, so I'm like, okay, we might need to delete this. And it's nothing against you. It's just that I gotta free
yeah.
up space because it's not just podcasting, but schoolwork. And so like I'll delete the video, but then I'm like, is the video still there? Like yesterday, I was looking back
Mm,
and being like, is this episode still out there? And it was. So I'm like, okay, great. Now let's take notes. So yeah,
yeah.
anxiety
I
kicks in all the time.
I know. For me, actually, I realized too, I don't like stop conversations in my podcast, but some people will say things that I'm like, ooh, I don't know. It might be like controversial, or it might just be something that like I personally don't agree with, that I'm kind of like, I don't feel comfortable putting this out there. And I think when you're doing a podcast as sensitive and I think, very authentic, is like talking about mental health, it's really important when I'm like cutting stuff out or doing stuff that I let my guests know that I like, hey, I took this out just because I it didn't really sit well with me, and I really just want to like dig into it deeper, but probably not put it out on a podcast or on this episode, or it doesn't like relate to the episode in some way. So yeah, that's something, that's a little uncomfortableness that I've had to do on my end, is re-listening to it and be like, ooh, that actually like didn't come out that well when you listen to it as a viewer.
Yeah, for sure. I do the same thing where I'm like,
Yeah.
ooh, should I not? What do they think? So then sometimes I'll make sure, just to make sure.
Yeah.
Um, Before I let you go, first of all, I've enjoyed this conversation so much. I think this may
Yeah.
have been the longest interview I've done, but
Oh.
I love, I'm glad that we do this because these are the conversations I want. Sometimes like I'll meet with people and sometimes and like they'll say they don't want to do, they'll only do like 20 or 30 minutes. And I'm sure they have
Mhm.
the reasons, but I'm like, how can you be authentic in 30 minutes? Um,
It's yeah.
it can be a challenge, but I understand that my podcast, and I'm sure for your like you with your podcast, it may not be for everyone, and that's okay at the end of the day.
Yeah.
My last question is regarding, so you love reading books. You talked about that in your podcast. You're into literature and all that. I was thinking about this as you were talking and about the literature or like your passion, or actually maybe I brought it up in the introduction when you were talking
Mhm.
about as someone who focuses on storytelling, you also have a passion for literature. And if this question is irrelevant, we can throw it out. But there are many words in the dictionary. There's 1,000 words um, out there. What's one word, or what are a set of words, or what are some words that you're thinking of that are not in your dictionary? Because you are an advocate, you have a journey where you're overcoming obstacles. You talked about your being diagnosed with general anxiety disorder. Your journey is difficult just like everyone else's, but when you kind of think about like what are some of the things that you don't want to associate yourself with, I kind of want to make it a little bit more friendly in the sense that what are some words you're thinking of that you don't want to ever think about because it's not a part of you. I don't know if that made sense, but
Yeah,
like
no, that did make sense.
yeah.
It's such a hard question. I think, ooh, that's such a hard question. I think there aren't really, I think that's a virtue of, being able to have difficult conversations and not really. So like I don't see, for me, I'm always the type of person too where like I'll have conversations with people who have maybe views that I find problematic or very different. For me, some words that aren't in my dictionary is just like, I feel like for me, one word would be like stigma. Like, stigma is truly like mental health advocates' greatest enemy. It's like that is the number one villain that we are fighting. And for me, I just hate that word, that it even exists, that there are even these barriers for people who need help, or for people to even acknowledge that there might be something that, they need to talk to someone about. Like it's just so, and it's so hard. And it's funny because we always like use that word, like we throw it around, right? Like, oh my God, it's the stigma. Like, oh, that's such a, stigma, whatever. But it really is this huge force. It's not just a word. It's a really scary thing that can trick people into thinking that they're okay or that everything's fine when it's really not fine. And I see that for myself, but I also see that for my friends and family, right? Like the cultural stigma has taught them that they can't look they can't feel in front of their family. They can't talk about their emotions, right? Something that I feel like my dad has experienced. And that is the worst thing for me because I am your daughter. I'm here and willing to talk about you. I'm literally pulling it out of you, like trying to, tug of war it. But it's really that stigma in there. That's a mental block in your brain. So that's a word that I just like don't associate with. I really want to, it's like my number one thing that I'm fighting for my podcast. So yeah, that would be a word. And in any of the like, just the like, racism and, sexism, all those isms, just because I feel like, why are we, you know, honing in on our differences? Like we should be celebrating our differences, especially when it comes to mental health, where we're all super different. It's very unique. We shouldn't be hyper fixated on all these things that like make us separate. So yeah, I didn't know where that was going. I thought you were gonna be like, Alyx, what is your favorite book? And I would have been like, okay.
Uh, no, I was just thinking like, see, this is me overthinking. I love
Yeah,
overthinking.
you came out on the fly. Look at you. Wow, you could be like a television host.
And no, here's the thing. Like, I struggle with this question. I don't know exactly what words are not in my dictionary, but the
Yeah.
only reason why I asked was because yesterday I was looking at one of my episodes, and there was someone who I asked about. I think I said, "What does failure look like to you?" And
Ooh.
he looked at me as if I asked the most ridiculous question on the planet. He's like, "What does that mean? What is that word?" Right? Failure doesn't exist in my dictionary,
Ah.
right? Even if bad things happen, I don't see it as a failure. I see it as an opportunity to grow. And so I mean, obviously I'm just kind of paraphrasing everything he said, but I just thought about it like it's interesting how even though they're just words, words have meaning, but for some
Mm.
people you can throw that word at them and they'll feel numb to it. So I was curious to know about your perspectives, and no, I'm glad that you've like sometimes I was just like, does that make sense? It may sound weird, but I'm glad you understood what I was saying and you gave a really good answer. So I do appreciate that. It
Yeah.
didn't sound stupid after all.
No, no, you're good.
Oh my gosh. Well, Alyx, I know I've taken a lot of time and I know you are a very busy person, but I just want to say thank you so much for joining the podcast. I I know I say this with about every episode. Like I say it's my favorite episode or one of my favorite episodes. I would put it up there as one of my favorite episodes as well because this is the type of thing I really want to have is those honest and authentic conversations. And so um I would love to be on your podcast if that ever happens.
Yeah,
But
I can't wait to see you on my podcast.
nevertheless, thank you so much for being able to share your story and sharing more about, your anxiety, because I know it's not an easy thing to talk
Mhm.
about, but nevertheless, best of luck with your mental health activism. Best of luck with A is for anxious. I know I'm going to listen to the next episode. Um, I'm gonna listen to more episodes by the time this episode comes out, because I know there'll be a couple more. But nevertheless, it was so great talking to you, and yeah, I mean, we could talk for hours, but I mean, I'm not Joe Rogan, but
Yeah.
nevertheless, it was great to connect with you in a very authentic and meaning in a authentic and personal way.
Yeah. Well, thanks for having me. Yeah. Thanks.
Thank you guys so much for listening to this episode. If you guys like what you saw, be sure to subscribe to this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. You can also follow us on Instagram at the OMCG Podcast for more information on guests, preview clips, and more. Please continue to support this podcast in the future, and I can't wait to see you guys in the next episode.